You do say that we're inclined toward idolatry in the West today?
Well, actually, I wish I had said that. That's Paul Tillich, the great Protestant theologian. He said it's one of the greatest things human beings do is create idols. That doesn't mean we're endlessly creating statues of Shiva or something and bowing down in front of them, but that we raise our ideas and our ideals and make them absolute. And it's not just religious people who do that. We can raise the nation or the people or a political ideology to that high status and sacrifice everything to it, absolute status, what happened in Nazi Germany, for example. And when you get idolatry, when you have an idea of God that is inadequate, because it is basically imagining God as sort of a larger version of ourselves, writ large, with likes and dislikes similar to our own very often. You know, people are often saying God loves this, God forbids that, and God hates the other. And it's uncanny how frequently the opinions of the deity coincide with those of the speaker. It's what we tend to do. We think that God must be on our side in an election or a war, even though our opponents are also God's children, who are also presumably the objects of his love and care equally. We remind God that he's created the world, and we are miserable sinners, as though it slipped his mind in some way. We're very talkative, so we do this, but we do it with, once you raise an idea of God to absolute status, an idolatrous conception of God to absolute status, so that is God, then religion becomes violent. Because there can only be one absolute. And the idolater feels obliged to destroy any rival claimants. So the Crusaders went into battle crying, God wills it, when they slaughtered Jews and Muslims. Obviously projecting their own fear and loathing onto a deity they were creating in their own image and likeness, and making this deity give their heinous atrocities a seal of absolute approval. And this is what terrorists are doing today. That's why people like Dennis were so concerned, because our notion of the biblical personalized God can very easily become an idol. It's one of its weaknesses, in a sense. Brahman, you can't personalize Brahman. You can't talk to Brahman, because Brahman is you, as well as everything else. You can't get outside yourself. Brahman is certainly not a personality, though it includes personality. It's harder to make an idol out of Brahman. But, very often we hear about God when we're about 3 or 4 at the same time as we're learning about Santa Claus. And our ideas of Santa Claus mature and become more sophisticated in time. But the ideas of God we have, speaking to us and living in heaven, etc., and loving us, this often gets stuck. And we don't take it on Dennis-like, in a Brahmodja-like way. And also, we've got into the habit, this is another whole issue, in the modern period, since the scientific revolution, of thinking of God as a fact. Thinking that our idea of God is a fact. And that's when everything started to change for us in the West, I think. It's when great scientific geniuses like Newton and Descartes claimed that they'd found a scientific proof for God's existence. I mean, St. Thomas Aquinas would have been absolutely appalled by this idea, and Dennis would have been revolving in his grave in horror. Newton said that the incredible solar system that he had uncovered must have what we now call an intelligent designer, somebody who'd started it. His physics didn't work without God to start it off. and it proved scientifically that the Bible was right. There was an omniscient, omnipotent being who existed out there, who was, and here I quote Newton, obviously very well versed in mechanics and geometry. And here we have Newton sort of seeing himself right up there a bit. He used to say when he was at his work, "Oh God, in ecstasy, I think thy thoughts after thee." Now, this wouldn't have mattered a jot, except that two things happened. One, it was only a matter of time before later generations of science didn't need God to start their solar systems, and they could find a natural explanation for it and didn't need the God as fact to start it off. But that wouldn't have mattered if the Christians, first the theologians, then the philosophers of the Enlightenment, and then finally the evangelical Christians, brought Newton's scientific God into the center of Christian faith in the West. And saw God as fact, and insisted, especially during the 17th and 18th, and for a good deal of the 19th century, that the best way to achieve knowledge of God was through science. And of course, once Darwin comes along, the older habits of thought have got lost. People have even forgotten who Dennis is. And they are left without resource. And there's a sort of desperation. And Paul Tillich said, that, I put this onto him, that even much orthodox theology today is idolatrous. Because it's talking about God too easily. Like this, when I was 8 years old, I learned this definition of God in the Catholic Catechism. God is the Supreme Spirit, who alone exists of himself, and who is infinite in all perfections. Now I can still rattle it off, as you see, all these many, many decades later. I have to say it didn't mean much to me at 8. But, and I still find it a rather arid and pompous definition, but I also think it's incorrect, because it takes it for granted that you can simply draw breath and define a word that literally means to set limits upon, a reality that must go beyond what we can think and know, that lifts us up with awe and wonder in that Einstein kind of way and makes us contemplate the wonders of the unknown. But that God is a bit of an idol. It's, Dennis and people said God is not the supreme being. He's not a being at all, because a supreme being is just like one of us, but just the last of a series. And as Thomas Aquinas also said, to say, is there a God, does a God exist, is no good. We think about beings, ordinary things in this world, in terms of categories or species, so that I can say, well, that's a glass of water, or that's a mountain, or that's a river, that's a human being. We learn to recognize by the sort of things people are. God, says Thomas Aquinas, is not a sort of thing. And so, he's not a being, he's not the supreme, certainly not himself. Again, I wasn't taught, to take the next step. I was taught, Dennis would have said, fine, you can say that, then you've got to deny it and say, no, God does not exist, God is not the supreme being, and then gradually lift myself up into unknowing. But a lot of us have got stranded with a rather inadequate idea of God as fact. And once you've got God as fact, you've got the strong possibility of atheism.